Hi everyone, welcome. Hi, I'm Peter. I'm the Master of Architecture Program Coordinator. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here today. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. We have a really great lecture by Usman Haque. He's here from London to speak to us. I'm going to introduce him in a moment. Before I do that, let me tell you really quickly about our M.Arch program, about SUTD, and about our lecture series. SUTD prides itself on being a technology-oriented program for architecture that is dedicated to a more user-friendly, a more human-centric, and a more sustainable world by design. I think you, many of you are, the students are laughing at the at this propaganda for SUTD, but this is true. This is what we pride ourselves on. We have really great research work in this area. Some of the examples are here. And the M.Arch program is part of this research focus for SUTD. So with our students, we're exploring topical, relevant areas for architecture for the development of cities, applying technology directly to solving challenges that are pertinent to industry and future forward as well. And within that context, it's great to have a leader from the world of interactive architecture joining us today. Usman is our first lecturer, guest speaker this season. We have additional speakers. We have Larry coming from Board of Architects, talking to us about research and practice later in the term. We have Chan-Soo Kien of SCDA coming in June, also sharing with us about the history of his practice and the future of practice for our students. Kat Wong and Brian Young from Bjarke Ingels Group are coming from Denmark later in July, sharing with us about their kind of journey through the world of architectural practice. And we'll be wrapping up our lecture series this term with Chie Kono, who has a practice in Kyoto, TECO, and is also faculty at the Kyoto Institute of Technology. So I hope that you can join us for all these lectures. We're really excited to include you in the discussion. Wonderful. So let me introduce Usman Haque. Usman Haque is trained as an architect. He is the founder and creative director of Umbrellium. This is a London-based design and build studio dedicated to transforming urban environments. Umbrellium first came to my attention with Thingful, which was this amazing kind of global phenomenon, a search engine for all of the IoT devices in the world. A really remarkable way of discovering what was happening with IoT and looking at opportunities for connecting IoT devices. It was something that really struck my imagination when you did it, Usman, and it's wonderful to meet you in person and hear your story. Umbrellium also has recent work looking at sustainability, sustainable cities in the context of architecture, participation, and technology. This is exceptionally relevant to what we do at SUTD. We have students that are really passionate about these topics as well, so it's wonderful to have you here to speak to them. Usman's work embraces many disciplines, including design, architecture, Internet of Things, urban community, infrastructure, and large-scale public art and performance. So it's really interdisciplinary, again, a key word for us at SUTD. Usman was Design Council Ambassador in 2021 to the Mayor of London's Data for London Advisory Board. Sorry, I mangled that one. Maybe you can enlighten us. My apologies. Usman taught at the Bartlett School of Architecture with Stephen Gage in the Interactive Architecture workshop. He also led the Urban Design Cluster, Participatory Systems for Networked Urban Environments with Adam Greenfield. Usman is the recipient of the 2008 Design of the Year Award for Interactive Design from the Design Museum, UK, a 2009 World Technology Award for Art, Japan Media Arts Festival Excellence Prize, 2004, and the Asia Digital Art Award Grand Prize, 2005. So incredibly distinguished. It's wonderful to have you with us today. And after the awkward introduction, please take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for introducing me. Thank you also for everyone's time and for having me here for this conversation. I'm feeling a bit bashful under this photo, looking as rough as I do compared to the carefully crafted photo. But I want to talk to you today about architecture, really. I am an architect, but I don't do what's perhaps conventionally thought of as buildings. Almost none of my projects are actually about building in the conventional sense, but all of them somehow are to do with connecting people and place and systems. And that's probably the unifying aspect of every project that I've done. On the other hand, every project I've done really materializes as something completely different. I've really almost never worked in the same medium, so they always look like different projects. But every single thing that I'm trying to do is, in a sense, my attempt at contributing to the discipline known as architecture, because that is the discipline that I would like to have some, even if small, effect on. Even though sometimes I do find myself in the category of art, or in the category of technology, or even in the category of entrepreneurship. Along the way, I've created a few different companies to do with interactive architecture, the Internet of Things, urban technology, community activation, and these sorts of things. But what I really want to talk about today is about an approach to architecture that embraces these kind of things. And I'm hoping, I was saying to Peter earlier, that if there's one place that where this stuff actually makes sense, the conjunction of architecture, technology, and people, it must be at SUTD's Architecture School, where technology, design, and environment all kind of come together. And so that's really what I'd like to talk about today as I kind of go through some of the projects. So, you know, anytime you're talking about technology, to a certain extent, you're talking about the future, or at least there is this sort of implication when you're talking about technology that you are doing with a view to the future. Now, there used to be this idea that the future was defined as a singular prospect. There was this kind of vision for the future. Architects have a vision for the future. Authority figures have a vision for the future. Authors, science fiction writers, artists. And there is this almost assumption built into this idea of the future that it is predictable and inevitable. You very often hear people say, you know, this will happen. This technology will enable this to happen, or this will be the consequence of this kind of technology, and so on and so forth. Now, if such certainty about the future was so clear, then we could have taken the horse and carriage and predicted the automobile. And having predicted the automobile, we could have predicted the traffic jam. And from the traffic jam, we could have predicted the effects that those have on the climate. And as a result of the kind of social pressures that arise due to this kind of environmental phenomenon, we could have predicted the use of the automobile as a terrorist weapon. And I just don't think that you could have extrapolated that from the horse and carriage. And the reason for that is that technology is actually not inevitable. It is not predictable. It is a social construct. It is developed collaboratively, and it's a complex and often chaotic phenomenon that we are all part of. It's not just determined by companies in Silicon Valley, even though at the moment, largely, these sort of corporate structures are making a lot of decisions on our behalf about how we're going to relate to each other and the environments around us, and how we're going to look towards the future. And to a certain extent, their impact on architecture must be something that we think of, not just in terms of the technical aspect of the technology, but again, as a sociological phenomenon. That's really what I'm most interested in, is thinking about technology as a social construct and what it is that I can do to a certain extent to help create a shared vision, a shared memory, if you like, of other possible futures that are not inevitable. I, as an architect, I actually don't know what the right future is. I don't know what this clear vision of what we should all be working towards is. If I did, I would urge you not to trust me, because there's no way that one person is going to get that right. And it's got to be a collectively, collaboratively constructed idea where we're probably not going to agree with each other as it materializes. And this is the kind of fundamental reality of dealing with things like climate change that I think are imperative when you're working on technology, when you're working on cities and so on and so forth, and when you're trying to sort of invent things for the near future. Now, it might be that some people like to speculate about the future. I choose to build. I'm interested in building for now and the near term and using that process really to start to question what is the future that we want, enabling people to experience it, to try things out together, to use their creative imagination, to try and invent it themselves, to test their hypotheses about the future, really to get actively involved to a certain extent in being part of the creation of the city. Now, you might think that I'd be about to talk about the smart city, and I really want to assure you that when I'm talking about technology, I'm just not interested in smart. I'm not interested in this idea that technology is about optimization and security and efficiency and creating the best shopping experience or what have you. I know that it can do all those things, and I also know that it can be used for all sorts of consequential acts as a result of that. I'm interested in how technology can actually be used to embrace the kind of unpredictable and creative side of people. And so this is what I call messiness. I'm interested in the messiness of people. So not smart cities, but messy cities. Things that are complex and chaotic and unpredictable and serendipitous and potentially creative. I'm interested in technology to support meaningful experiences about building shared memories of a possible future. So to that extent, I'm interested in engaged cities. Again, not smart cities, but engaged cities where people are actively involved, collaboratively inventing this kind of future. And then I'm interested in cities where people are actually, through technology, reconnected to the natural world, who are able to treat non-human species on an equitable basis. I'm interested in cities where people themselves can explore what it means to be wild. So these are the things I want to talk through today. Messy cities, engaged cities, and wild cities. So let's kick off with messy cities. I'm going to be drinking a lot because I get quite thirsty when I'm talking. I'll also say one thing. I'm very happy for anyone to ask any questions while I'm talking. Don't hold off till the end. I would much prefer this to be a sort of dialogue and to take digressions if necessary. So just raise your hand and I'll very happily pause what I'm saying and take it on. Please do. I'm going to start with a project that actually was here in Singapore back in 2006. It was part of the opening of the Singapore Biennale. And I was invited to do something on Padang as part of this opening ceremony. Something that would involve potentially a couple of thousand people. And I wanted to show this image because almost every project that I've done, to a certain extent, starts at home. And we actually set up a production line in my living room to create what basically became a sort of a Lego kit with carbon fiber, balloons, and electronics. So you can see me in the middle, a very young me, standing next to one of these modules, where the idea was that I wanted to create a Lego kit that members of the public could then construct structures in public space. The carbon fiber is about 2 meters in length, and each balloon actually inflates up to almost 1 meter across. And inside each balloon are some electronics and sensors that respond to each other, as well as to signals from nearby balloons. We called this the balloon-to-balloon network. We laid it out on Padang for people to come together and start to assemble and design things. This was really the thing that was interesting to me, was not for me to design the structure, but to think about, to enable other people to use this to build something much larger. Then, as the structure started taking form, they started inflating it, and then slowly nightfall came, and it started to go up. There's an interactive handlebar on one edge of this, which is where 200 people have to hold on to keep it down. This is 2006 quality video. I'm sorry, it's not quite up to today's standards. But if you can see in the little inset image down there, this ended up being an 18-story structure that really transformed the skyline, albeit only for one night. And the way that the colors mix within this structure is explicitly determined by how the members of the public designed this form as a whole. If they'd assembled it in a different way, those colors would have mixed in a very different way. At the bottom, you can see people with the interactive handlebar. You could pump color up, you could wave it, you could shake it, and it would trigger different types of patterns of color going up through the structure as a whole. I'll show you just a few photos which might give a slightly better sense of the scale and and how it unfolded. So this was one of the first projects I did where I was trying to think about how to work with potentially thousands of people to create something on the scale of the city where they themselves, their kind of unpredictable creative aspect will generate the final outcome. And what was kind of gratifying was that shortly after, I came across this blog post by somebody who's involved in it, who didn't mention anything about the Biennale, about art or architecture or anything, but simply said, I feel proud to be able to say, that's my baby up there. I designed and constructed a part of it. Because that was the key to this project, was really that somebody else should feel that sense of ownership and kind of activation through it. And again, 10 years later, somebody came up to me after a talk and said, here's my scrapbook about my evening on this project. And so that really was the thing that I was after with this. That sense of design and accomplishment that we architects will feel, but which most ordinary people don't necessarily think they'll ever be part of. That feeling of creativity and actually changing something in the city, even if in this case, as in this case, it was only for one night. Jumping ahead here by about 8 years, Assemblance was again a project about trying to capture people's innate sense of creativity, but one where I wanted to sort of encourage collaboration. And so I created this, basically a laser interface where you could use your hand and body through gestures to create three-dimensional forms in space. And if you work with somebody else to do that, then your light structures are actually quite robust, and they'll respond to you like physical objects. So if you push it, it would last, and it would actually persist in three-dimensional space for longer. If you work on a structure on your own, it would be more fragile, and if somebody else walked through it, it would shatter and disappear. And so this was really a kind of an exploration of how to encourage people to do things together, to embrace a kind of a collaborative creativity through a three-dimensional interface, which is, you could sort of think of it as an augmented reality, except it's actually physically there. You can physically see it in space. And as part of the, here you can see somebody actually pushing the light beam. Hopefully you can see in the lights are a bit bright on the thing itself. So while there was light that you could see but not feel, there was also air currents being blown that you could feel but not see. And so that's why you saw that smoke ring passing through the light, where somebody had actually triggered a solid column of air to go through. So again, this was this idea of not having any expectation about what would be built, but actually just to almost provide an adult's sort of playground to see what they would create together, and more specifically, when they would create things collaboratively. We did a slightly larger version outdoors in public space where people could use their voices to do the same thing and generate these sort of quite elaborate three-dimensional environments, again collaboratively, and again kind of responding to them. So this is the first kind of like if you like, the idea of spaces that are messy and unpredictable, and yes, technology activated, but they're really about that experience that doesn't just assume that we're all kind of automatons. So let's move on to engaged cities. So as I said, engagement for me is about constructing these meaningful experiences where we're creating a shared memory of a possible future. So exploring ways to actively get people involved and put them at the center rather than the technology. And the first project I want to talk about here is Starling Crossing. So in most cities today, the pedestrian crossing, is getting more and more complex. In most cities today, we're starting to see roads that have the addition not just of vehicular traffic, but cycle lanes, bus lanes, scooter lanes, potentially autonomous vehicles, delivery bots, drones, and in the near future, even flying taxis. The question is, where do people fit into this? Pedestrians. With the move towards 15-minute cities and with the move towards trying to encourage all sorts of micromobility, there is a need really for these kind of intersections to be responding to people rather than vehicles. Right now, most crossings are designed to optimize traffic flow and not people's experience of each other and people's experience of safety. And so what we decided to do basically was to create an interactive pedestrian crossing where the safest possible crossing would change over time depending on how people used it. So that, for example, if a lot of kids get out of school at 4 p.m. every day, the crossing would be outside the school gates and would be very large to accommodate big crowds of people going by. If later on there's a cinema that lets out late at night, which is a little bit further down the road, right now what would happen is that people would not walk to the crossing, they would simply cross the road. So instead, the crossing would be moved over time to where it's actually needed. So we actually built this as a proof of concept in South London. This is a road that's takes the weight of vehicles. It works outdoors in the sun and in rain, and it is a surface that essentially can redraw the road markings so that it's basically optimizing the people's experience rather than the vehicles experience. And so this was done really as a proof of concept to understand what happens and how do people use a crossing when it can respond to their needs. And what are the safety language, the visual language that's needed both for the pedestrians as well as for the vehicles when the crossing is not always there. Because the problem we have, well, the good thing that we have about painted lines is they're always there, we always know what they are, but that also means that if the use of the space changes over time, even over the course of a day, then very often it ends up not being used. I don't think Singapore is quite like London, but you'll almost never see people crossing at the crossing, or you'll see them crossing when the light has gone red simply because the timing doesn't work the way that people actually need to use the street. And also, of course, the road can be used to highlight dangerous conditions. Now this, as I said, was just a proof of concept, but what we've done is we've moved on and we've extracted the most useful part of this and partnered with a number of companies that are building the hardware. And so our software is now controlling these kind of hardwares and embedded LEDs in the road surface, warning signals, and the intelligent traffic systems in some public roads in France and now in pilots in the UK. So the idea here that I really want to get across is that you can start by thinking about now and the near future and a people-oriented approach, and you can build this up into something that actually becomes a commercial company. We've spun this out of Umbrellium now, and it's a separate company called Starling Technologies. But this started really with my walk to work every day and having to cross several rather complex intersections and almost getting run over at 3 of them, even though I fundamentally believe that walking, cycling, taking low emission forms of transport are really important for the future of the city. Now, on a similar kind of note of public transportation, Flight Path Toronto was a project that I was commissioned to do. Originally, they approached me in 2008, 2009. And it took a couple of years to develop. I collaborated with an artist and engineer called Natalie Jeremijenko, whose particular focus is on birds in the city. And the context for this project was Nathan Phillips Square, which is in the center of Toronto. It is, it's kind of like their Padang. It's right outside of City Hall. And the event in 2011 would have 1 million people coming. And so they wanted to do a project that would in some way get people actively engaged with the city, and more importantly, with some kind of near future idea of the city and what they could be part of. While I was there in some of my early site visits, I realized that this square was filled with birds all the time. They're just flying everywhere. And the locals have a very diverse range of responses to these birds. And what really struck me was how they occupied the square in a way that no human can, which is basically in 3 dimensions. And I started wondering about how the birds see the city and how we humans might be able to inhabit the city in 3 dimensions and really sort of expand and augment our relationship to urban infrastructure. I was also interested in the zip line. Now, the zip line is, of course, a technology which has been used for many thousands of years for moving goods and people across often quite long distances. It's fast, it's fun, it's emissionless, and I'd been wanting to explore how to use the zip line as a form of rapid transport within the city, but also one that could be very quickly deployed and redeployed in a way that, for example, cycle lanes cannot be. They take quite a long time to plan, take quite a long time to execute, and the effects are sometimes quite hard to see in the short term, whereas the zip line could be implemented quite quickly. And so marrying these kind of 2 ideas together, what we ended up doing was basically creating zip lines across the city center where people could learn how to fly around the city and test out this novel form of public transportation. This is one of the very early tests where we were trying out different types of wings. We had the pigeon wing, we had the turkey vulture wing, and we had a couple of other species of wing just to really understand the different aerodynamic properties that they might have as you move through space. As I said, this project took a couple of years to design and to experiment with. So eventually, in October 2011, we set up a flight school in Nathan Phillips Square. We actually set up a control tower with the lasers, sort of working along the lines of assemblance, which I just showed you, which was that there's this kind of central thing which is controlled by people's voices and gestures. And people could go through flight school, learn about birds' relationship to the city, to the urban environment, and how they see the urban environment. And they could then strap on, do a quick flight test, and then they themselves could start to fly around the city with different wing types and really start to experiment with what it would be like to take a zip line to school, to take a zip line to work, and question this idea of, like, why are we not doing something which is fast, fun, and emissionless, and which could very quickly be deployed around the city to get people going actually quite long distances, or potentially even to move goods around the city. Early morning when there's distribution, for example, just of a baker distributing their goods in a polluting vehicle, they could be ziplined around the city just as easily. So over the course of the evening, as I said, there were about 1 million people there. Not quite a million people managed to fly, but those who were on the ground were using this laser control tower to issue and create forms that would be part of controlling where the flights would take off from and where they would go. And so we had people of all ages, from young to old, really just trying this out. And as I said, trying to build this shared memory of a possible future. So I'm just going to finish now talking about wild cities. This is the stuff I'm working on most at the moment, which is ways to reconnect people back to the natural environment. Now, obviously, this distinction between humans and non-humans is a bit of an arbitrary one, which we've kind of built up in the so-called modern world, but which didn't necessarily, was not necessarily such a binary before. And I'm really interested to both see how we can become more wild, as well as we can start to connect better with these kind of natural, non-human species. One project where I first started looking at this was for a new community on the outskirts of Cambridge. This was going to be a new group of people who had never lived before, that were going to be moving into this part of the town. And I was commissioned about 3 years before it was opened to work on the school that was going to be at the heart of this community, Trumpington Community College. The plan for this school was that it was going to be a very high-tech building filled with sustainability systems and all sorts of IoT sensors and weather stations and so on and so forth. And also, it has a very novel STEM program and a novel classroom approach, which is open and collaborative, where the students would be working together, where the plan really was that the students should be an integral part of the community, not just of the school, but their relationship of the school to the surrounding environment. And so when I was brought into this project, the question was, could we work with the students before they even come to the school, before the school was built, to try and figure out something that would connect them to the environment, to the building, and in some way to the curriculum of science and technology that they would be working on. So we worked with them for 3 years and eventually created an augmented reality cat that was connected to the building management systems in the building, the sustainability systems, and changes size, behavior, color, and all these kind of things that the students help to co-create. And they can interact with this cat, and in so doing, understand the current state of the building and its environmental situation, its resource consumption, its sensor data. But when the cat gets tired and hungry, it goes out on the network and appears on one student's laptop and starts to beg for food. That student has to make a decision about how much food to feed Cinder, because the food is generated by the solar panels. And so they have to think about the weather, how much sun there's been, how much energy has been used by the building, and they have to make a decision about how much resource to allocate to the cat. And so in a sense what they're doing is they're making a decision about how they're going to take care of the resource management of this building. But it's personified in this cat that they have an ongoing relationship to. Now, the idea behind the data model here was that Cinder is really going to be there for at least 20 years. That was the plan. And as technology has evolved, there are different kind of representations that can be applied on top of that. So when we did this, of course, augmented reality was not necessarily a native feature of most mobile phones, but that would be now very easy to implement on top. Fundamentally, though, this is about that relationship that they have to the building itself and to each other in taking care of it. And that's why it's more than just a data visualization, because they actually care about it, and they've built in, as part of their kind of creative input, a number of Easter eggs into Cinder, so that over the years, various things that will happen that are quite unpredictable. For example, if you do a certain thing on May the 4th, which happens to be Star Wars Day, Cinder will appear with a lightsaber. And a few other things will happen in the next sort of 12, 15 years. Next project I want to talk about is more recent. And it's a project called Rewild. So I was invited to be creative director on an urban wilding scheme, a vision really, for East London. The idea was that, as is happening in a number of cities, the local authority and Eden Project, which is one of Britain's biggest environmental attractions. I was actually working with Eden Lab, which is associated with the Eden Project. Wanted to explore what it would mean to rewild East London, and more specifically, look at how to reconnect people to natural systems. And so I worked with the local authority and with a range of community organizations around East London over a couple of years, and we've developed a scheme for essentially creating a headquarters for urban wilding. Now, when you do rewilding in a rural context, it's fairly straightforward in a science and ecological sense. There are a lot of, we sort of know how to reintroduce species into landscapes. But in the city, it's complicated by the fact that different communities have very different ideas of what it means to be green, what the implications are when you lose green space, for example, for wild meadows. And more importantly, there's very different kind of cultural relationships to nature and what it even means to be wild. So the whole idea behind this scheme really was to find different ways to get people to do stuff together and in collaboration with all sorts of natural systems. So there's a rewild school, and there's a range of these community initiatives, first of all, that just get people growing things together, eating together, learning about waste cycles, and actually how to take care of the environment. That's sort of just one level. There's another level, which is all about the kind of actually building up the ecosystem, improving the biodiversity, creating tree houses and tree offices in the landscape so that people don't have to go into buildings. They can actually be in the landscape as they're meeting and eating together. There's a proposal essentially for a whole bunch of the green infrastructure that I'm sure you're quite familiar with, where we're actually turning the buildings themselves into sites for non-human species. And then finally, there's a digital infrastructure. And this is essentially something that I thought of as a kind of an internet of living things, a way for people to connect to the natural environment and try to understand its kind of context and history over time. So the proposal is essentially that every resource, every natural resource that is reintroduced into the landscape, or that is introduced really, because in the city it's very hard to say what was there before, every natural resource that's introduced into these landscapes has an ID in the system, has a context, and has a representation that will be added to over time through sensor systems, through people contributing to data, so that it should be possible over the next 10 to 20 years that when you walk up to a tree, you can find out who planted it, where are its siblings, how was it planted, why was it planted that way, what is its contribution to, for example, air quality mitigation, what are the sensor values telling you about the environment, how can the tree, in conjunction with all the other trees that happen to be its siblings, how have they acted as a proxy for all sorts of environmental responses. And all of this is being fed back into the headquarters, into a space where this data can be accessed by members of the public. And this space is really, I kind of conceived it as the opposite of what you would conventionally think of as a smart city operations center. You know, the smart city operations center, as a cliche, is this kind of dark room filled with monitors, and it's all about controlling and surveillance and small groups of closed groups making decisions on behalf of others, algorithms making decisions on behalf of others. This is conceived really as an open space for discussion and deliberation and accessing data from the natural environment in real time so that you can start to make decisions about, potentially in citizen assemblies, about the environment of the near future, about how we're going to respond to climate change, and what this is actually going to mean for the cities around us. So as I said, this is a 10-year vision. The project has got some funding, but it's currently on hold, sort of for semi-political reasons. But essentially the idea here is that the project's about not just rewilding the borough, but actually rewilding people themselves, actually enabling them to become more wild. And I'm just going to finish with a project that I have just started. I actually haven't spoken about this project before, so this is my first time discussing it. It's still in the prototype phase, and that means I'm still kind of trying to explore exactly what it means and where it's going to go. But I thought it'd be useful to show this because I think it crystallizes what I'm trying to say in Wild Cities. So there's a lot of discussion these days, obviously, about what it means to be intelligent. What does intelligence mean, particularly, with these range of generative AIs that are now easily accessible by anyone? And what's particularly interesting to me is how it's affected our notion of what is human and what is artificial. To be perfectly frank, I'm not that interested in whether or not it's intelligent. But I am interested in how our relationship to what we are calling artificial is blurry and uncertain. One of the big topics is, does it really mean anything? Is it just a massively statistical process? What does this mean for creativity when this system can also generate, albeit on top of a lot of work by other humans, but it is generating things that haven't been created before? And what occurred to me was that our question about, if you like, the personhood of these kind of systems is so similar to the debate that we have about so-called natural intelligence. We're constantly, and we have been, at least in the so-called modern world, tended to think of natural intelligence as something that's separate from human beings. Often something that's sort of less than human. But the thing that I've realized is that our relationship to these two phenomena is actually very similar, which is that it's causing us to question what it means to be human. So what's most interesting to me is to figure out ways to kind of connect these things all together and almost to treat them as equivalent and see what happens when they're all working together. Now, when they're all working together, I think that what we have is conversation. And I use this word with a very specific meaning, which comes out of second-order cybernetics. I'm not going to go deeply into second-order cybernetics, but if you're interested in conversation theory, check out Gordon Pask. He wrote an essay called The Architectural Relevance of Cybernetics. It influenced a lot of people in the 70s and 80s, particularly Cedric Price. In fact, he collaborated with Cedric Price and has been a very big influence on me. I also wrote an essay myself called The Architectural Relevance of Gordon Pask, which hopefully closes the circle. So this is the sort of thing that I'm currently looking at. And I have a roof terrace in London. I'm very lucky. That's not a very common thing. But I've tried to grow stuff there. I do not have a green thumb by nature, but I took it as a challenge when I moved in because it looked horrible to actually sort of experiment with this. And over time, quite a lot of stuff has grown up. In particular, I have an olive tree. Now, an olive tree typically comes from the Mediterranean, but it has managed to thrive, at least for the last sort of 6 years or so, in London. This olive tree it seems to me to be the one tree that sort of sticks out here. And so I wanted to figure out how it's feeling. So going back to that triangle with my olive tree, I realized that if I took real-time data about the tree, so I plug in a lot of sensors into the tree, into the soil, into the tree itself to get information about how the tree is from a purely data-oriented perspective through metrics that I have chosen, that could be a sort of a proxy for the natural part of the equation. And I realized that children, particularly under the age of 10, have a relationship to natural systems that is much more open and embracing than adults do. They really do understand the personhood of non-humans in a way that we adults mostly have forgotten. If I took a child's interpretation of the sensor reading, so for example, when it's below 0, maybe it's bored. When it's above 35, maybe it's angry. I apply that to the sensor data, so I've got a sort of a child's mapping of the sensor data, and then I feed both of those in to one of OpenAI's, you might know ChatGPT. I'm actually using the API here, so I'm feeding that in to the large language model that I could close this equation. So I could connect up the natural, the human, and the artificial, really to start to have some kind of a conversation with it. So this is what I've done. I've taken a bunch of sensors. Some of these are actually simulated for the moment, because as I said, this is just a prototype. The grayed out ones are simulated. A weather station that's actually generating data about the wider environment. I've set up a very complex prompt that basically tells the olive tree about who it is in human terms and where it's come from, its identity and its history. I've given it some context, so it knows what's planted next to it, what its soil is, and also I've given it the capacity to ask me more about its context. And then I've fed in the child's mapping of the sensor data so that it has an interpolation matrix for all of this data to translate the purely data-oriented approach into a phenomenological and language-based representation, which things like ChatGPT are so good at interpolating between, so that effectively I can start to have a conversation with my olive tree. Now, the prompt that I use, I'm assuming that at least some of you have experimented with ChatGPT and you understand the idea that you give it a prompt and then you can start to build up question and answer with it. My prompt is actually, this is an earlier prompt. My prompt is actually now far more complex than this, but this is the prompt that sets out all of the stuff I just described so I can start to have conversations with it. So one of the first things I said was, how are you feeling today? You know, feeling a bit overwhelmed, trying to stay optimistic, feeling more grounded and connected to my environment. You know, I'm doing my best to adapt and thrive in these conditions. Do you enjoy your neighbors? Well, you know, grateful for their presence and the role they play in creating a diverse and vibrant community. You know, so far, so polite. So over time, you know, the weather's changing. Sometimes I forget to speak. You know, check in again. How you doing? Well, you know, two weeks ago it was hot and humid. You know, I was able to cope with these conditions thanks to my adaptability to different environments. Because remember, it's an olive tree that comes from the Mediterranean. It's an immigrant, which the UK is expressing some concern about these days, and surreptitiously these very cranky trees are moving in. Then it started sort of saying, well, you know, actually it was scorching, high temperature, I was feeling dehydrated. You know, it starts to actually worry about its health and well-being. By the way, sorry, this I did actually simulate increasing the temperature because I was interested to think about what happens as climate change causes wider disruption. And it starts to think about what it might do and what it might be able to do if it could make sounds. You know, I might make sounds like a gurgling stream or a waterfall. I also wish to make the sound of a gentle breeze rustling through my leaves so that it would provide me with some respite from the oppressive heat. This is where it really took me by surprise, which it said, you know, when your cat peed on me, I was a bit distressed and concerned. I was wondering, you know, how it knew that I had given it the context that there is a cat that uses this that uses this roof terrace. I do have a cat. His name is Taku, and he does actually like to hang out about here. And I'm supposing that something about the pH level changing and some other combination of environmental factors was there. And it said, I'm worried about the impact this could have on my health. If I could express my thoughts and feelings, I would have felt violated and disrespected. And I hope that in future you can ensure that your cat does not urinate on me. It's important to remember that trees like me are not just objects, but living organisms that play a vital role in the ecosystem. Now, I wasn't having any of that. I was like, wait a second. Cats are part of the natural environment as well. Isn't it beneficial to the soil to have these sort of chemicals returned to it? And, again, it sort of explained to me, well, yeah, it's very good for the soil, but it's not very good for my roots. And in fact, that conjunction can attract pests and predators. So I'd really prefer if they didn't use me as a restroom. So, I think the thing that I want to get across here is not the question of whether this is a real conversation or not. I will tell you that it felt real to me, and in terms of meaning really only matters when the person themselves feels that meaning. I mean, even a conversation with another human being, you do not have access to what their meaning is or what they're thinking or whether even your framework of reference maps onto theirs. The only thing you have is conversation, which over time enables you to inhabit and question and prod their sense of meaning or their perspective, and over time to feel that there is meaning in those interactions. And so in a very similar way, I am also connected to and developing meaning through them, through my interactions with this olive tree. I've only done it for a couple of months, but what occurs to me is like, what is going to happen to my relationship to this tree, and indeed all the other stuff on my roof terrace, and ultimately I'd like to do this on a much wider basis, when we can have these kind of nuanced conversations with these living organisms over time, and actually develop ongoing relationships that connect up all these kind of human, artificial, and natural systems. Because I think that if we could have these kind of conversations, and by conversations I specifically mean these connections and iterative processes uniting all three of these with the natural environment, that over time we would develop a much more deep sense of empathy and responsibility and engagement with that urban environment. And it would start to be something that we would contribute to as we are creating new ideas for the city, for these wild cities where we humans, as well as the non-humans, have some kind of an equitable relationship. And so with that, I would like to say thank you for listening, and do let me know if you have any questions.